In the quiet cemetery in the state of Utah, a young woman had lain for nearly 50 years. Investigators had spent 46 years puzzling over this case, but they lacked sufficient evidence. All the clues were buried with the victim in her grave. Now her remains were being exhumed to determine the identity of her killer. Would any evidence or leads still be present in the grave after 46 years? Could this woman name her murderer from beyond the grave? July 31st, 1970. It was a hot summer morning in the small town of Prius, Utah. 4-year-old Heidi woke up to an eerie silence. It was so quiet that it felt unsettling. Heidi approached the door and peeked into the next room through the keyhole. Something was on the floor of the living room, resembling a pile of clothes. When she opened the door, she saw blood everywhere. Her mother's lifeless body lay on the floor. Terrified by what she saw, Heidi ran outside and told a neighbor that her mother was lying in a pool of blood. The neighbor immediately called 911. Police arrived quickly at the scene. They were horrified by what they saw. The woman lay on the floor in a pool of blood, which had splattered onto the nearby couch. The front door was wide open, with no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the woman knew her killer. There was no sign of a struggle, as nothing seemed out of place in the house. This indicated that there was no fight between the victim and the assailant. The woman's clothing was partially torn, suggesting she had likely been assaulted. Police meticulously combed the crime scene, collecting fingerprints and taking samples from the carpet and the couch to be sent to a lab in Washington. After examining the scene, the police were given the victim's name by the neighbor who had called them. It was 23-year-old Loretta Jones. Loretta was a single mother raising her daughter. Everyone knew her as a kind and quiet woman. She had given birth to Heidi at 19. Loretta was a devoted mother, spending most of her time with her daughter. Her murder shocked the entire town. Loretta's body was sent to the morgue for examination by a medical examiner. Loretta had 17 stab wounds on her body. 13 were on her back, 2 on her chest, 1 on her neck, and 1 on her heart. These wounds were inflicted with intense rage, indicating a strong emotional connection between the attacker and the victim. This further suggested that Loretta knew her killer. The medical examiner concluded that the wounds were made with a small, sharp knife. However, no knife was found at the scene. Given the nature of the wounds, the examiner came to a startling conclusion. Loretta had not defended herself. Typically, a person under such an attack would fight for their life, resulting in different wound patterns. The only defensive wound found was on Loretta's wrist. Investigators were baffled. Why hadn't she defended herself? Experts reached a chilling conclusion. Loretta hadn't screamed to protect her daughter. She understood that if she screamed, her daughter would come, and the killer might harm her too. The medical examiner found evidence that confirmed the investigators' suspicions. Semen was discovered in Loretta's genital area. While finding semen could help identify the perpetrator, DNA testing was not available in the 1970s. This technology only became available in the 1980s. However, experts collected nail and hair samples for future analysis. The police's only hope was the sole witness of that night, 4-year-old Heidi. They asked if she had seen or heard anything that night. Heidi said she hadn't seen or heard anything, though she was too young to fully understand what had happened. She sensed something terrible had occurred and cried. When a person is murdered, police usually first suspect the spouse or partner. Loretta's relationship with Heidi's biological father had been very brief. After Heidi was born, they never saw each other again. Loretta's parents stated that their daughter had no boyfriend. During the investigation, several unemployed men in the town were questioned but released due to lack of evidence. The local police sought help from the FBI in Washington, but their investigation also yielded no results. While the police continued their investigation, Loretta's family prepared for her funeral. They couldn't have imagined that 46 years later, this grave would be reopened. For a 4-year-old, seeing her murdered mother in a pool of blood was a profound trauma. Heidi didn't fully understand what had happened. She told her relatives that her mother looked like a sleeping beauty from fairy tales. After her mother's death, Heidi went to live with her grandparents, who stored Loretta's belongings in their garage and rented out her house. 39 years later. Years passed, and time moved on. Heidi was now 43 years old. Much had changed over the years. Her grandparents were no longer alive. The unanswered questions about her mother's murder had haunted her all this time. From the age of 20, Heidi had written numerous letters to the Utah Sheriff's Office and the FBI, pleading for them to find her mother's killer. Despite several investigations by law enforcement, they all came up empty. On July 4, 2009, Heidi's car was stolen. She posted about it on Facebook, and a friend named David Brewer, who worked at the Carbon County Sheriff's Office in Utah, responded. David offered to help find her car. When Heidi learned that David was a detective, she told him about her mother's murder in 1970 and asked for his help in solving the case. David was a relatively new detective and had never worked on a murder case before, but he decided to investigate. However, he hit a major roadblock right away. The case file with all the evidence and photos related to Loretta's murder was missing. Investigating the case without these crucial documents was nearly impossible. David informed Heidi about the missing file. Heidi searched through her family's photo albums and found several pictures her grandfather had taken in the room where Loretta was murdered just one day after the crime. She gave these photos to David. David examined the pictures carefully, hoping to find any evidence that previous detectives might have missed. In one photo, 4-year-old Heidi stood near the beaded curtain, looking at the camera, close to where her mother's body had been found. David had a thought. The killer might have injured himself while stabbing the victim, and his blood could have splattered on the nearby items, including the beaded curtain. However, he quickly dismissed the idea, thinking the curtain likely wouldn't have survived all these years. But then Heidi mentioned that her grandmother had stored all of Loretta's belongings in the garage. They found the beaded curtain in a box and sent it to the Utah State Crime Lab, hoping to find the killer's DNA. David published articles in the media about reopening the murder case to find witnesses from that time. A few days later, a woman named Linda called him. She said she had been renting a room at Loretta's parents' house in 1970. A few days after the murder, Heidi's grandfather had taken Linda with him to retrieve some of Heidi's belongings from Loretta's house. He had instructed Linda not to enter the room where Loretta was killed, but curiosity got the best of her, and she went in. Linda told David that before Loretta died, she had written the name of her killer on the floor with her own blood. It was hard to believe such a story. David remarked that such things only happened in movies, but Linda insisted it was true. The detectives had a photo taken at the crime scene by Heidi's grandfather. Experts used special software to analyze the photo, and when they saw the results, they were stunned. Visible in the pool of blood on the floor were the letters T and O. The realization that Loretta had tried to write her killer's name with her blood in her final moments shocked the investigators. When David told Heidi about this, she was astonished. She had never heard about it from her grandparents. It was unclear if the police in the 1970s knew about this, given the missing case file. David and Heidi were now trying to solve a puzzle. Who could this person with the initials T and O be? The initials meant nothing to Heidi. She tried to recall her childhood memories, searching for any silhouettes that might match these initials. David began searching through archives and found a newspaper that had published an article about Loretta's murder in 1970. He discovered that another crime had occurred in the town on the same day as Loretta's murder, just 3 blocks away from her house. A 10-year-old girl had been abducted. Lori Coulter, now an adult, called David and revealed that she was that girl. On July 30th, 1970, 10-year-old Lori was playing outside when a man attacked her. He covered her mouth with one hand, but Lori managed to shift her mouth slightly and scream. The man fled immediately. Lori's mother reported the incident to the police. In her statement, Lori described the man as wearing a yellow hat, jeans, and a white t-shirt.
He was wearing a thin jacket on top.
The girl says that the man smelled like a cheeseburger. The man who attacked Lori turns out to be 30-year-old Tom Eagley. A few hours later, Loretta, who is 3 blocks away, is killed. Tom is familiar to Heidi. It's as if she had come across the name somewhere, but she couldn't remember it at all. Sora remembers Heidi's newspaper that she saw in a box at her grandmother's house. She finds that newspaper clipping and sees the picture of Tom Eagley that Lori talked about. Her grandmother told 10-year-old Lori, because of the attack, Dale kept Tom because he was suspected in the murder of Loretta in 1970. Heidi, looking carefully at Tom's painting, has vague memories that are not clear to her. Heidi finds a notebook in that box, and when she opens it, she realizes that it is a diary. Her grandmother started writing a diary from the day her daughter was killed. She recorded every word her 4-year-old granddaughter said about the moment of her murder. Heidi said, "I heard my footsteps, and he said, 'I'm going to kill you. When you're done, I'm going to kill your daughter. I heard a sound. My mother fell to the ground. She was dead. I saw her through the door. It was Tom who killed my mother.'" As she flips through the pages, the memories hidden in the depths of Heidi's memory begin to emerge slowly. She realizes that she has seen more than she can remember. 4-year-old Heidi actually witnessed her mother's murder. Tom Eagley was sentenced to 3 months in prison for attacking 10-year-old Lori. It is known from the notes of Harry's grandmother that in 1970 the police determined that Loretta and Tom were in a relationship. They met for 2 months, but there was no material evidence against Tom. The statement of 4-year-old Heidi was not enough to bring charges against him. In order to protect her granddaughter from psychological trauma, Heidi's grandmother used her diary and the material she collected from her daughter's murder. He put it in a box and hid it. Since then, this subject was never discussed in their house. The woman who worked as a clerk at the trial of Loretta's murder in 1970, and who is currently on probation, calls David and tells him that she has kept the transcript of that trial at her home until now, because it was her first court case. Finally, the detective David can get acquainted with the full report prepared in 1970 about the murder of Loretta. Protocol included witness statements, as well as the statements of Heidi's grandparents, and the report of the forensic expert. One of the witnesses was Marcia, who was Tom Eagley's girlfriend at the time. It was a woman. David meets her and asks questions about the incident. Marcia says that every day Tom comes home very late, around 3-4 in the morning. He goes into the bathroom and takes a bath without taking off his clothes. The next day, he takes his clothes to the laundry. When Tom returns home, Marcia notices that one of his pants and one of his pants are missing. That's why he threw it in the garbage. Hearing this, David bites his finger. There could only be one reason for Tom's behavior like this: to get rid of the evidence. David was already convinced that it was Tim who killed Loretta. David goes to where Tom lives, in Rocky Forge, Colorado, and meets with him. He asks questions about Loretta's murder. Tom does not remember the name of the woman he used to love. But when the detective asks him what he did that day, he says that he came to Pricetown, drank beer in a cafe, and ate a cheeseburger. It turns out that he is on the right track and should continue his investigation. But how would he prove that Tom is guilty? David was faced with the dilemma faced by detectives in 1970. He had no solid evidence that Tom was at the scene of the crime that evening. His hope was in the answer from the laboratory. The experts were examining all the beads one by one. They can't find any blood samples. David doesn't like no for an answer. He decides to exhume Loretta's body to get to the point, and tells Heidi about it. Heidi replies, "Give me a shovel. I'll help you dig." He wanted to put his mother's killer in jail no matter what. Any evidence that was buried with Loretta could play a decisive role in finding the killer with the help of new methods that have been developed in the field of forensics for 46 years. But there was one problem. The body had been buried under the ground for 46 years. It was a difficult task to find evidence that had not been changed or little changed in the grave during that time. In the summer of 2016, David published news in the mass media about the reopening of the criminal case that happened 46 years ago, and that the body would be exhumed, and thus Tom Eagley's head. He wanted to see his reaction to those who would give him. Finally, Loretta's coffin is taken out of the grave. Water was pouring from one side of the coffin. In such a case, it was very unlikely that any evidence could be found. Loretta's remains are being thoroughly examined in the forensics laboratory. The experts can't find any evidence to take a DNA sample. This leaves Heidi and the detective very frustrated. They have only one option left: use the media to bluff and get Tom Eagley to confess to the crime. A few days later, the detective gets a call from a woman named Lisa Carter. Lisa lived next door to Tom Eagley in Rochefort. Lisa occasionally went to Tom's house, and they would sit in the attic and talk. Tom trusted Lisa. It was a great opportunity for the detective. It couldn't be. David orders Lisa to secretly record Tom's conversation and instructs him on what to say and what questions to ask. Lisa starts going to Tom's house 2 to 3 times a week, talking to Tom and recording all conversations on a dictaphone. Lisa, he tells Tom that the police have found sperm DNA on Loretta's remains and that they will soon find the killer. He tells Tom that because the climate in Utah is dry, the evidence was preserved well. Believing that everything was true, Tom finally kills Loretta with a pocket knife. But that wasn't enough to incriminate him. For that, he had to confess to the crime in detail. Detective David goes to Tom's house again and tells him that he wants to talk about Loretta's murder. Tom believed that the police had already collected his DNA and that the truth would soon be revealed. That's why he confesses everything to the detective. On July 30th, 1970, Tom Eagley knocks on Loretta's door at about 9:30 p.m. Loretta lets him in because she knows him, and they have met a few times. Tom wants to be intimate with Loretta, loses his temper. Tom attacks and rapes Loretta. Then he pulls out a pocket knife and stabs her repeatedly. Then he leaves the house, leaving Loretta dead on the floor in a pool of blood. 76-year-old Tom Eagley, in August 2016, he is imprisoned at his home in Colorado and brought to Utah. At the court held in November 2016, he states that he regrets what he did and apologizes to Heidi, who killed her mother when she was 4 years old. Heidi Jones can finally find answers to the questions that bother her and succeeds in punishing his mother's killer. Tom Eagley is sentenced to 4 life imprisonment.